Christianity is under tremendous siege. We are getting less and less and less powerful in terms of a religion and in terms of a force. If I'm there, you're going to have plenty of power. You don't need anybody else. You're going to have somebody representing you very, very well. Remember that.
You have to wonder if the use of "we" there was ironic. That was Donald Trump courting the evangelical vote during the 2016 election, and it worked. The man who had been married 3 times, who had an affair with a porn star, who owned casinos and promoted gambling, was credibly accused of sexual assault by at least 25 women and bragged about it on tape, was embraced first begrudgingly and then pretty enthusiastically by Christian evangelicals. It's a phenomenon that the journalist Tim Alberta explores in his new book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. Alberta writes this, quote, "A relationship that was once nakedly transactional, Christians trading their support sans enthusiasm in return for specific policies, had morphed into something else entirely. Trump was no longer the lesser of two evils, a grin and bear it alternative to 4 years of President Hillary Clinton and 3 pro-choice Supreme Court justices. Polling showed that born-again Christian conservatives, once the president's softest backers, were now his most unflinching advocates. Why? Well, with the answer, perhaps. Joining us now, staff writer for The Atlantic and author of the new book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in the Age of Extremism, Tim Alberta. Tim, great to have you here. Thank you so much for your great reporting. Thanks to your colleagues at The Atlantic for the great edition that they've just put out. We end that passage with why? Because everybody gets the transactional part. Everybody gets the hold your nose, vote for Trump. He'll get Supreme Court justices, he'll get Roe overturned, and he'll do things that are in keeping with our goals.
Yeah.
But then what happened? What changed?
Yeah. Well, listen, I think this is the million-dollar question for a lot of folks, and the simplest explanation I can give, you heard Donald Trump give voice to it in that opening clip, when he says that Christianity is under siege in this country, and I will give you power if you vote for me. It's difficult to appreciate if you did not grow up steeped in the evangelical tradition. This idea that has been percolating for decades inside the church, particularly inside the white evangelical church, that Christianity will sooner or later be in the crosshairs in America, that the church will be persecuted, that Christians will be sort of banished from public life, and really, over the last 5 to 6 years, between COVID-19, between obviously Trump's election and then re-election in January 6th, what we've seen is almost an apocalyptic sense take hold within the church, whereas it was once, yes, we're giving you our votes in exchange for these policies. It's now become this thing where a lot of Christians truly do believe that it's no longer R versus D, red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat. This is good versus evil,
right?
That this is a spiritual war, and that Trump, despite not sharing any of their core values or reading their same book or praying their same prayers, that he is their protector.
Yes.
He is almost their mercenary who can keep them safe from the outside.
And he started to, in his speeches in the last 6 months or so, use that kind of language.
Yes.
Now, some of us who study this will say that that's the language of autocrats and dictators and authoritarians, but some of it's evangelical. Some of it's literal savior type language, which if you're a savior, I suppose you can use. But how does he convince people that whatever you think the threat that faces you is, I am somehow the avenger, the protector?
You know, you're right in diagnosing where this language really comes from. And I think some of the genius, if you want to call it that, of Trump's approach to these particular voters is sort of marrying the authoritarian with the messianic, right? And merging the two together and effectively saying, listen, as many Christians believe that this country has a divine conception, that it is a uniquely blessed country, that to some degree almost this country is in covenant with God. And so what Trump has really effectively persuaded these folks to believe is that an attack on America is an attack on God. And more specifically, I would even say that an attack on Christian America, an attack on the idyllic Judeo-Christian America of their youth, the America that they believe is meant to be, that is meant to endure, that any attack on that is actually an attack on God himself. And so when you begin to think that way, you begin to process everyday partisan political disputes through that process, through that lens of existential good versus evil, these stakes that are so high. When I would just emphasize this, that if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, you are taught to believe that the battle is already won. That there's nothing that can happen on this earth that could possibly jeopardize the kingdom of heaven to which you are ultimately called to be a citizen. And so this national idolatry that has infected the evangelical church is a grave danger to not just our pluralistic society, but to the church itself.
So let me ask you this, because in fundamentalist countries, in religious environments, secularism is always thought of as the abiding threat, right? The absence of the book, the absence of religious law. What's the threat that people feel is coming to Judeo-Christian America? Is it secularism? Is it immigration? Is it the other? What is the thing that Donald Trump is in theory protecting you from?
Yeah, well, look, I think you have to view the external threat, but then also the internal threat. And that's where the last several years have been very revealing. First, the external threat is sort of the same as it was 50 years ago when Jerry Falwell Sr. was building out his moral majority, and you saw the televangelist crusades and a lot of this talk around, the schools being corrupted and indoctrinating children. Obviously, all that's old is new again. That is the same rhetoric we hear today. You hear about the government coming for the churches, which, by the way, during COVID-19, when blue state governors were issuing shutdown orders, that was like a prophecy being fulfilled for a lot of these folks, saying, see, we told you. We've been telling you for decades this was happening. I also think, though, we have to appreciate the internal threat or the perceived internal threat. And what I mean by that is, you might ask the question, why is it that when Donald Trump rips Mike Pence in front of an audience of thousands of evangelical Christians, that they're going wild, cheering Trump and jeering, booing Mike Pence? I thought that these were Mike Pence's people. The internal threat now, and you hear this from evangelical figureheads around the country who are tapping into this grievance and this fear, it's that people like Mike Pence are no longer sufficiently tough. They're not militant enough. They're not willing to fight for Christianity in the way that Trump is willing to fight for Christianity. So that internal threat that is now the subject of so much ridicule and mocking and scorn from some of those movement figures, it is basically rooted in this idea that if pastors are unwilling to turn their pulpits into like Fox News soapbox, then they are not willing to really fight to defend their faith. And again, that divide inside the church has fractured congregations all across the country, and it's not showing any sign of letting up.
Mike Pence, the guy who gave voters, evangelical voters, the cover to vote for Donald Trump, never made it past 3%. I want to read from your book about Trump being turned into a Christ-like figure. A New York Times Siena poll of the Republican primary showed that 76% of white evangelicals believed Trump had not committed any serious crime. According to a Marist survey, 81% of white evangelicals had a favorable impression of Trump. The exhaustion voters had expressed earlier in the year had vanished. The greater Trump's criminal difficulties, the greater his support from evangelical Christians. I want to ask you about this because we're talking a lot about Donald Trump's legal woes, which he describes in two ways. To the non-religious group, he talks about it as an imposition on his First Amendment rights. He was just talking about how he lost the election. But to others, it's a persecution. Sometimes he uses the term witch hunt, but to others, he really uses the term, I'm the most persecuted person in America. Is he appealing to this crowd?
Absolutely. And when you think about Donald Trump using that language, when you think about the 91 indictments, right? People need to understand that Trump is not succeeding in retaining his support among evangelicals in spite of the 91 indictments. He's succeeding because of that. This plays directly into the persecution complex that we've been talking about throughout this conversation. I think it's really important to recognize that Donald Trump was actually losing a lot of his support among those evangelical voters in the aftermath of the 2020 election. And as soon as Alvin Bragg delivered that first indictment, we've watched it. It's just correlation, causation. The numbers have gone right back up.
Wow.
And Trump has even gone beyond the persecution language. It's martyrdom language.
Yes.
He has said basically, look, they've got to take me out first
Yes.
in order to get to you.
Yes.
And that language, I mean, we just can't stress this enough. It's dangerous.
Yep.
It's dangerous, and it's so incredibly damaging to ultimately to the witness of Jesus Christ. Because when you talk about, well, what is an evangelical Christian? There's a verb in there. It is to evangelize. It is to take the witness of Jesus out to the world, to those who do not know him. And we as Christians can't do that when those who don't know him, they hear the word evangelical and they just run for the hills because they think that we are hypocrites and opportunists and that we only wield our faith as a weapon to win the culture wars.
You say we. Your father was an evangelical preacher.
Yeah, he was.
You grew up in an environment. Is this foreign to you?
No, so my dad was an evangelical minister. I was raised literally, physically inside the church. My mother was on the staff of our church as well. And I've been walking with Jesus my entire life.
Yeah.
I think the difference here, the divergence, if you will, is that as I've grown older, and particularly in the last decade, the disillusionment with institutional Christianity has just become too much for me. And for a really long time, to be totally candid about it, I didn't want to say anything about this. I didn't want to speak out about it. It's really uncomfortable to criticize your own tribe.
Sure.
And it just got to a point where, as I saw it in my own family, as I saw it in my own faith community, something was deeply wrong here. And again, I think even for those watching who are not themselves believers, but who are deeply invested in this idea of a pluralistic society, we have to have these conversations around what has happened in the church. And I know that there are, for all the doom and gloom here, I just want to be clear, there are millions and millions of Christians just like me, who, regardless of who they vote for, regardless of where they land on different cultural issues, they want to reclaim their faith tradition from this sort of radical fringe that has overrun it.
You are a journalist for The Times, Tim. Thank you very much for being with us. Tim Alberta is a staff writer with The Atlantic. He's the author of a great new book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in the Age of Extremism. The book is out tomorrow.